In the aftermath of the Second World War, political leaders built a global system of free trade because they believed it was crucial to world peace. Like so much of the post-war order, that belief is under assault in the 21st century. Our guest today argues that free trade agreements can serve their original purpose, even while helping workers. She's Karen Tramontano, this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University, alongside my friend and colleague G. Wayne Miller from the Providence Journal. Each week we sit down with storytellers and analysts to make sense of the stories that shape public policy debates. This week we're joined by Karen Tramontano, CEO of Blue Star Strategies in Washington, D.C., and author of a recent study arguing that the narrative and the reality on trade can be reshaped to the benefit of workers. Karen, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
So why have American political leaders of both parties championed free trade since the end of World War II, and what's changed today?
So I think for the last 70 years, Jim, as you've said, there's pretty much been a social and economic compact with not only the American people, but I would say citizens in the globe, that open markets, fair trade, really does inure to the economic benefit of most people. And I think that played out in our country. Incomes rose, job creation, various sectors expanding in the economy, much more productivity. So what happened? From 70 years ago and every year after that, trade and other factors, but trade in particular is quite disruptive in certain sectors and to workers, especially workers who are less educated in jobs that require less skill. Economies move at lightning speed, and there's a lot of changes. And both Republicans and Democrats, largely in the U.S. Congress, either ignored it or knew that this disruption had to be addressed and left workers on their own, either as a matter of political philosophy. In the case of Democrats, I think there were always struggles to do more, but there's always this tension between acknowledging that there is loss, because you actually have to do something about it. And in the case of many Republicans, I think not even acknowledging that there was loss or that government has a role. So you continue that, letting workers down who did not benefit from international trade over years, and you end up with the perfect storm eventually.
But it seems like I can remember in ancient history when NAFTA was being negotiated, right? So this was something that was negotiated by President George H.W. Bush, but went into effect under the presidency of Bill Clinton, your old boss.
Yep.
There was bipartisan agreement, even if you maybe disagreed with some of the particulars that might have been negotiated. It seems today that there is still bipartisan agreement, but that bipartisan agreement is in opposition to trade.
Yes and no. I mean, I think there is still a really broad consensus in the middle among Democrats and Republicans. And I think the facts, clearly spell this out, that international trade, I mean, take the service sector, right? The trajectory is just up, right? Income, well-paid jobs, technology, even our agricultural sector, right? Benefits. So people who are not being populist, but who are being realist, understand the benefits of trade. And then you have the far left and the far right of both parties that are really accentuating the fact that people are left out and we haven't done what we need to do as a country for those people. And that's getting polarized.
Use the term perfect storm to describe the culmination of this past 70-year period. I think that perfect storm was the election of 2016. We certainly saw a lot of that in that election. What was the story being told in the 2016 election? I mean, there were several, but there was a dominant one being told by many people who backed President Trump.
So I think the perfect storm sort of begins in 2008 and 2009. And we have just a financial crisis that, sets working people way back in what they thought they could achieve, diminished their hopes of what they would like to achieve for themselves and for their children. And then we have a very slow recovery. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. It's, the Republicans did not help in that recovery, and the robustness of the infusion of capital that needed to happen in our country did not happen for a whole host of reasons. And that built over time where people more and more felt left out. And for the first time, you'd see in the primary, you see a Republican, Mr. Trump, taking an anti-trade position. That really never happened before. Republicans were not anti-trade, and whoever was elected to be the leader of their party or to be their candidate was always pro-trade. McCain, Romney.
Reliably.
Yeah. So what we end up seeing is the people who feel left out. And by the way, it's not just trade, it's more technology than it is trade. And it's more automation,
Absolutely.
Lack of education and training. But trade becomes the boogeyman for this. It's very easy to say to workers, you lost your job for trade. Now, you also have an American labor movement that, I hate to use this expression, but it was priming the pump for years and
you just
years.
invented that term.
Yeah, right. That's why I hate to use it. I used to use it all the time.
That's a great one.
Right, it is. Thank you, it's a great term. So, they've been priming the pump for years and years and years, telling American workers they're losing their job because of trade, because of NAFTA, because of the Central American Free Trade Agreement. So here's the perfect storm. You have a choice between an anti-trade Republican and a Democrat who says she's anti-trade but has a record of being, at least moderately for trade. And so workers say, well, wait a minute. I lost my job. My friend lost his job or her job. My union leader has been telling me it's because of trade. And now I have a clear choice. I have somebody who's anti-trade, and I have somebody who's, I'm not sure. And that's the narrative that took hold. Unfortunately, Trump's policies will not, my belief anyway, will not help one single worker, because his policies are all looking back, and they're all highly legalistic, 301 lawsuits against dumping and the like. But what we need is investments in education and investments in training, a really robust social safety net for these workers.
So we're going to talk maybe in a little bit about the president's budget, but let me stay on the trade issue for just another moment. When I look at a graphic depiction of the major ports of the world, it looks like the big international trading centers are in Europe and in Asia today. And it's not that the United States is not a player, but the big ports are in Europe and in Asia. And there's part of me that wonders, does that have anything to do with the transition of the American economy from manufacturing to a more service-related economy, where the type of service that you're exporting is different? Mm-hmm.
Well, yes and no. LA is a huge port. Mm-hmm. New Orleans is a huge port, and lots of goods and commodities go back and forth. I think it is true that our trajectory, because of international trade in services, far outpaces Europe and Asia in services. agriculture, our exports in agriculture are on their way back up. And frankly, they would have been booming with a passage of a TPP. You know, somebody in the Trump administration should have looked at that before they walked away from it. Manufacturing, you know, is up and down, very cyclical. It has always been very cyclical. It had an uptick in the Clinton administration where jobs in manufacturing actually went up. If we have the right policies in manufacturing, you can actually see those upticks in manufacturing. But with the wrong policies and regressive policies, that's not going to happen.
I want to go back to use the term disruption in the lives of a lot of blue-collar workers, and that certainly is an accurate term, and in some cases with some of these people it was worse than disruption.
Right.
And then you began to talk about some of the measures that might address that. You talked about education and training. Can you expand on that? Because I think those are very vital pieces, or should be vital pieces of public policy.
Oh, I completely agree with you. So currently we have an unemployment insurance system that was created back in the 50s and 60s. And it's just not adaptable to the modern economy. And why I say that is the following reason. It's a 18-week to 24-week payment because you're unemployed, providing you check a box and look for work. And it was set up that way because of the industries that we had. There was, if you look back at the steel industry, for example, there would always be, a 10, 12, 16, 18-week layoff because steel and aluminum is very cyclical. That unemployment policy is designed knowing that you're going to get your same job back after you have this temporary loss of work. That is not our economy anymore. We have not changed that system. We need to change that system so it reflects the fact that people are not in their jobs for 20 or 30 years. And in fact, they're changing jobs, and the time between jobs is a lot longer, and it's not cyclical, and they're not going back to that same job. They need to get new skills, new training, increase their education to get that transition back into the economy. The other absolutely absurd policy we had was the trade adjustment assistance. We forced workers to prove that they lost their job because of trade to be entitled to enhanced benefits. Now, I submit that if we want to convince a population that trade is the cause of their job loss, put a carrot, better benefits, and a trajectory of where they have to go and what they have to prove. And you're going to have everybody saying, yes, I lost my job because of trade and I can prove it. So bad public policy. We do not have a system like the Germans have, for example, that look at their economy and what industries are going up, what industries are going down, how to transition those workers, internships, apprenticeships, wage insurance. And when you lose your job in Europe, you have health insurance, right? And so none of those factors are at play in our social safety net. In fact, we can transition to the budget. All of those are going to be cut if Trump's budget is approved.
We need to take a quick moment for station identification. Sure. This is Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. This program can be heard 4 times each weekend on Sirius XM Satellite Radio's channel 124, the POTUS channel. I'm Jim Lutis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. I tweet at JM Lutis. Every week I'm joined in the co-host chair by G. Wayne Miller from the Providence Journal. He tweets at G. Wayne Miller. Story in the Public Square is recorded at the studios of Rhode Island PBS in beautiful Providence, Rhode Island. Our guest this week is Karen Tramontano, who among her many hats is president and founder of the Global Fairness Initiative. She tweets at K Tramontano. That's KTRAMONTANO. Karen. So you published a study actually with the Pell Center in late 2016, Tearing Up Trade Agreements Won't Help Workers, a More Responsible Approach Just May. You argued some specific policy elements that might make trade more palatable to the American workers. And I wondered if we could just walk through them step by step. First, you said we need a robust social safety net and adjustment system for displaced workers. That's what you were just talking about.
Right, that's what we were just talking about. Right.
You said that we need strong and enforceable labor rights and provisions in trade agreements for workers in trading partner nations. What's that about?
So back in the Clinton administration, we were the first administration to do so, that in every trade agreement, the partner government had to be responsible for implementing labor standards. Now, what that language all means is the following. No government should be allowed to benefit and get a comparative advantage, if you will, by exploiting their workers. Worker exploitation impacts American workers, because if Ford decides that it's going to begin its supply chain in Indonesia, and that country allows worker exploitation, then that pretty much ensures that any other factor, like lack of transparency, rule of law, isn't going to come into play, because with wages so low, any company can absorb the cost of maybe some other factors that would normally go into play. If you have labor standards in a trade agreement, it doesn't mean you're paying every worker some global wage. No, it'll be set by, economic means in the country. But what it does mean is that U.S. corporations or European corporations, when they're looking at their supply chain, have to clearly evaluate labor as a cost and a commodity along with other factors. So it just makes it a more level playing field instead of allowing exploitation.
Would TPP have provided some of those protections?
Actually, TPP, and my hat goes off to Michael Froman, who was the ambassador responsible for negotiating for the United States, does probably the best job of any trade agreement with regard to labor standards and the implementation and the penalties if exploitation occurs. It's very real, very straightforward, and had countries, Vietnam and Japan and a host of other countries in the Pacific signing on the dotted line for the implementing ILO international labor standards.
The third big point the third big recommendation was strategic international development and technical assistance support to countries as part of a global U.S. approach to U.S. economic engagement. What would we be talking about there?
So if we are going to demand labor standards and environmental standards, which are highly technical and take a fair amount of expertise, we should, through our foreign assistance, support those governments in basically gaining the technical skills that they need to implement those. I mean, it would be irresponsible to have a trading partner held to a standard that we know they cannot achieve without providing that assistance. And TPP did that. And just as an aside, Trump talks about, NAFTA and changing NAFTA. In TPP, NAFTA provisions were changed, including the labor standards and the technical assistance provisions.
And Mexico would have been part of TPP.
Absolutely.
So in the public mind, or at least in the minds of some people, free trade, globalization are associated, and you're hitting on this now, with large corporations, greedy, profit-driven corporations preying on impoverished labor forces overseas in countries that have no environmental protections. Is there any truth to that?
I think in some cases, yes. For the most part, I would say no, because, at least, most U.S. corporations are not looking for major lawsuits. They're not
bad press,
or bad press
by the New York Times.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. And so, I don't think corporate America goes out and says, oh, let me find the worst labor conditions, the worst environmental standards, and that's where I want my supply chain to begin. That said, if workers are getting less than $1 a day, and it's unskilled labor needed in producing T-shirts, and that is the comparative advantage, why not go there, right? So there is some truth to that. And that's what I think our responsibility is as a government, to lift all boats up, if you will. And we can do that.
So occasionally when I am out of the studio and I'm talking to people about trade, I often hear you sort of make an intelligent, rational argument about the value of trade and from a national security perspective, for example. And people will often say to me, yeah, I hear you, but I feel like it's hurting my company, or I feel like it's hurting me personally. Mm-hmm. How do you confront what I call the feels?
Well, when I was working with in the Clinton administration, President Clinton, and we were trying to explain the impact of international trade, we went to the Harley-Davidson factory in Pennsylvania. There's one in Wisconsin and one in Pennsylvania. And those workers understood the value of trade because more Harleys were going out to Asia than people were buying in the United States. So not that storytelling is the answer to everything, but
it is on this show, though.
It is on this show.
We have to correct it. I'm sorry. It is the answer to everything.
But I think two things. One is truly acknowledging the harm that trade does cause in some cases. I mean, there's no doubt about that, and we've been denying that. Having a response to that brings people in a good transition back to a new economy, we have a responsibility as a government to do that. But also explaining to people what those benefits are. And we've been explaining the benefits, but we haven't been acknowledging the harm, and we certainly haven't been responding to it.
I want to sort of look at the flip side of this. Certainly a lot of manufacturing has, quote unquote, gone from the U.S. to overseas countries. And yet there's still a lot of manufacturing in this country. And I could think of many examples, but I think of the automobile industry. All of the Detroit companies still build here. Honda builds here. Toyota builds here. Mercedes-Benz has a factory here. BMW has. So we're building things. But we're not building them the same way. Automation is the difference here. Talk a little bit about that, because I think this is an area where people go, oh, it's all gone. It hasn't all gone. What has gone is the large labor force to create the same product.
No, that's exactly right. And it is the number one factor, not trade. Automation is really, in the manufacturing sector.
In terms of the
job loss.
Yeah.
It's a number one factor.
It's robots, I mean, to use the common term.
Yeah. I mean, so President Trump's solution to, is to, rip up trade agreements, et cetera, and have a much more robust, legalistic approach to trade. And what his team has said, they're going to file more 301 suits, so anti-dumping. So to your point, so let's say the Russians or India is dumping steel into the United States, which is, highly likely. Which means that their government is unfairly subsidizing that commodity, and so they're able to sell it at a much lower price. So our government files an anti-dumping lawsuit. Mr. Trump takes charge and does that. And 3-4 years down the road, U.S. government wins. Indian government has to pay penalties. What job is coming back as a result of that?
I don't see
that. That is the problem. Those jobs are either, in that 4-year time, are probably even more automated than they were before.
But it's a simple black and white story to tell, and that grips the minds of some people. I mean, that's the way some brains, maybe all brains, work on some level.
Yeah. Well, everybody likes simple solutions, right?
We all do. The magic bullet, the one pill that cures the disease, and so forth. Yeah.
In the last couple of minutes that we have here, we mentioned this, one of the things that you do with your time is you're the president and founder of the Global Fairness Initiative. Tell us a little bit about that and the work that it does.
Sure. Well, thank you for asking. So I started the Global Fairness Initiative about 15 years ago now, after I left the Clinton administration and President Clinton was our first chair. We focus on developing countries and the largest sector of their economy, which is the informal sector. This isn't the illegal sector or the gray economy. These are people who are very small farmers or very small entrepreneurs. The guy cutting somebody's hair on the sidewalk day in and day out. And we work with governments and with the private sector to move those very energetic people, very creative workers into the formalized economy. Why? So they can be protected, so they can be part of the Social Security system, but more importantly, so that income becomes part of the GDP of that country, and it helps them grow as well.
Does that advocacy dovetail with your support for free trade?
Actually, my support for free trade evolved from the Clinton administration when I was, actually out at workplaces, like I said, at Harley and Boeing, and realized that without trade, we would be losing far more jobs than we were retaining. But this work comes from also working with President Clinton in learning that in most developing countries, the informal sector of the economy is well over 60% of that economy.
Wow.
So if you ignore that, countries cannot get out of poverty. So that's where that passion comes from.
We just have a couple of seconds left here, but I have to ask, you worked for a number of years in the White House for Bill Clinton. What is your quick summary of President Trump's administration through 4 months?
About 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Well, it is, and again, this isn't a partisan statement. It's failing the American people because it is not approaching, he's not approaching the presidency, understanding the impact, the policy impact, not the political impact, but the policy impact he needs to have on the economy, on healthcare, on education. They do not have a policy process for formulating where we should be going as a country. And you can't tweet yourself out of the challenges that we have.
Karen, we've got to leave it there, but thank you so much for being with us. She's Karen Tramontano. If you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, please follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or you can visit us at pellcenter.org, where you can find Karen's study too. For G. Wayne Miller, I'm Jim Ludis. We hope you'll join us again next week for more Story in the Public Square.